I was finishing up work late one Wednesday, my mind already drifting toward the evening ahead. It was meant to be an ordinary night, with nothing but a quiet dinner and maybe some time on the couch in front of the TV. Claire had mentioned earlier that she'd be out with some work friends, another business meeting. That had always sounded innocuous enough, and I trusted her completely. After all, we'd been together for 12 years. In that time, Claire had been more than my wife, she'd been my partner, my confidant, the person who knew me inside out. Or at least, that's what I thought. When her text came through about the late meeting, I barely registered it. I was used to her schedule fluctuating, work dinners, business trips. This was routine. It's funny how you can be lulled into a false sense of security by routine. Then, it happened. The call that shifted everything. I was sipping a late coffee at my desk when my phone buzzed, showing an unfamiliar number. Usually, I'd let calls like that go to voicemail, but something made me pick up this time. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound polite but distant. "Hi, is this Mr. Anderson?" The voice on the other end was warm and professional. "Yes, speaking." "Great. This is Leslie from Crawford Jewelers. I just wanted to confirm the engraving details on the ring set for Claire Anderson." She hadn't finalized the message yet, and I just wanted to be sure we got it right before proceeding. I blinked, trying to process her words. Ring set? Engraving? I'd bought no ring, and certainly not from Crawford Jewelers. I swallowed, my voice calm but my stomach churning. "Sorry, could you clarify which ring this is for?" Oh, the sales clerk sounded slightly embarrassed, as though she'd accidentally revealed a surprise. "It's a wedding ring set Claire ordered, with a personal engraving. The rings were a special request for delivery to your address, actually." She laughed lightly, we just wanted to confirm before finalizing. She hadn't decided on the message yet. I gripped my phone tighter. I had no idea what she was talking about, but the feeling in my gut was unmistakable, a creeping, icy dread that something was horribly wrong. "Right. Of course. I'll make sure Claire gets back to you," I said, somehow keeping my voice level. I ended the call, staring at my phone as the seconds ticked by. It was as if I were watching a scene unfold from outside my own body, watching a reality I didn't recognize. I went over every possibility, tried to come up with an innocent explanation for why Claire would be buying a wedding ring set without telling me, why she'd need a custom engraving. But each time, the sinking feeling only deepened. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a lie I could feel twisting in my gut, no matter how much I wanted to deny it. I spent the next several days trying to brush it off, hoping for some perfectly logical explanation. But the doubts gnawed at me, invading every moment of my day. Soon, the memory of that phone call was everywhere, staining every thought. Every time Claire was late, every time she looked at her phone and quickly hid the screen, the unease grew. The worst part was how subtle it all was. There was no screaming confrontation, no moment of undeniable proof. Instead, it was a slow drip of small inconsistencies, half-truths, and the occasional look on her face when she thought I wasn't watching. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Eventually, I decided to stop pretending. The uneasy feeling had reached a point where I couldn't ignore it. I started paying more attention, noting every detail, her comings and goings, the exact wording of her texts, the way she seemed both too eager to please and oddly distant. She'd always been social, and I knew her work involved a lot of after-hours functions. But now, every late meeting set off a red flag. She'd call, say she'd be home by 10, and then slip in at midnight with a flimsy excuse about traffic or a drink with her team. One night, after she'd gone to bed, I couldn't help myself. I picked up her phone. She'd left it unlocked, carelessly. I took a deep breath, telling myself I wasn't crossing any line. I had a right to know if my suspicions were valid. At first, there was nothing unusual. The texts with her friends were standard fare, chit-chat about weekend plans, the occasional joke. But then I found a string of messages from a contact saved as Jeremy, work. My pulse quickened as I opened the chat. The text started innocently enough, a discussion about a work project, then a few late-night exchanges about things that didn't add up, inside jokes, casual plans to meet for drinks after work, all harmless on the surface but with an undercurrent that felt too close. My heart pounded as I read on, feeling like a stranger peering into a world I didn't recognize. And then, in the middle of one late-night conversation, it was there, "Can't wait to see you tonight. It feels too long every time we're apart." I could barely breathe. I reread the text over and over, the meaning hitting me like a slap. They weren't just colleagues. They weren't just friends. She'd been lying to me, spinning a web of half-truths that had stretched across our lives. For the rest of the night, I lay awake, replaying every moment, every sign I'd missed. Her late nights, her business trips, her sudden bursts of affection as if to placate a guilt that was eating away at her. I had been blind to it all, caught up in the illusion that we were still the happy, solid couple we'd once been. By morning, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. I needed a plan. Confronting her immediately would only lead to denials, to her spinning more lies in a desperate attempt to cover her tracks. I needed proof, something undeniable. Something she couldn't wriggle her way out of. So, I went to work like any other day, but my mind was spinning with ideas. I didn't know exactly how I would do it yet, but I would find a way. I would get every answer, every piece of the truth she'd hidden from me. She had built this lie, this facade of a life. Now, it was time for her to face what she'd done. The days that followed were surreal. I found myself slipping in and out of my regular life, all while carrying this unbearable weight. Claire, unaware that I knew, carried on as though nothing had changed. She'd go off to work, laughing and chatting on the phone in the mornings. Sometimes she'd even kiss me on the cheek before leaving, just like any other day. It felt like I was watching a performance, a play where I knew the ending but was helpless to change the story. The truth was, I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I had undeniable proof. The texts I'd seen that night haunted me, but I knew if I confronted her, she'd find a way to explain it away. People can be masters of denial when they need to be. And I needed something that couldn't be talked away, something concrete that would make her face her lies. I started with the basics. Each morning, I'd check our shared accounts and credit card statements, digging for anything unusual. My hands would shake as I logged in, wondering if I'd find some big-ticket charge or hotel booking that would confirm what I already knew. But Claire was smart, careful. She kept her spending tidy, using cash when she could or a separate account I couldn't access. I saw only small charges, gas station fill-ups, the occasional coffee shop expense. It was frustrating, seeing nothing out of place, nothing that screamed betrayal. But then, on a Tuesday evening, I caught a break. Claire's phone buzzed on the counter while she was upstairs, and I saw a preview of a message from Jeremy, work. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to stay calm. It was a brief message, an innocuous "See you Friday, can't wait." That alone wouldn't be proof of anything, but I made a mental note. Friday. Whatever she had planned with him was happening on Friday. That night, I barely slept. My mind was racing, trying to put together a plan. I decided to go to work as usual on Friday, act as though nothing was different. But once I was sure she'd left for her so-called work event, I'd follow her. I'd get the evidence I needed to confront her once and for all. When Friday came, I could barely contain my anticipation. I kept glancing at my watch, counting down the minutes. Claire was in high spirits that morning, more affectionate than usual, even giving me a long, lingering hug before she left. "Have a good day, honey," she said, smiling in a way that would have seemed so sincere if I didn't know what she was planning. I forced myself to return the smile. "You too. Don't work too hard." Once she was gone, I waited another hour before heading out. I didn't want to seem too obvious, and I needed to make sure she'd truly left the house and wasn't coming back for anything. I watched her car disappear down the street, and when I was sure she was gone, I got into my own car and followed her route as best I could. For a while, I drove aimlessly, my heart pounding as I scanned every intersection, every turn. I hadn't exactly planned how I'd find her, but I knew that sooner or later, I'd catch sight of her car. After about 20 minutes of driving, I finally spotted it, a silver sedan with a sticker on the rear window. It was parked outside a coffee shop on the edge of town, the kind of quiet, unassuming place that would be perfect for a discreet meeting. I parked a safe distance away and watched. After a few minutes, a tall, dark-haired man in a suit approached her car. Claire got out, smiling brightly as she greeted him. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was far from professional. My worst fears were confirmed. They went inside together, and I waited, forcing myself to stay calm. Every instinct told me to march in there and confront them on the spot, but I held back. I knew there would be time for that later. Right now, I needed more than an angry scene. I needed evidence, something irrefutable. Eventually, they came out, laughing and chatting as they headed back to his car. They drove off, and I followed at a safe distance, careful not to get too close. My hands were slick with sweat, my heart racing as I watched them disappear down a winding road that led out of town. They stopped at a small, secluded inn on the outskirts, a place that barely looked open. I watched as they entered together, hands intertwined, disappearing through the front door without a second glance. My stomach turned, a sick feeling settling in as I sat there, watching the inn like it was some sort of forbidden fortress. For a moment, I just sat there, grappling with the reality of what I'd seen. It felt surreal, like something out of a bad dream. The life I'd known, the trust I believed in, it was gone, shattered in a matter of minutes. The weight of it all crushed down on me, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. I knew there was no going back from this. Confronting her was inevitable now. But I wanted her to know that I'd seen everything. I wanted her to feel the shame of being exposed, the weight of the lie she'd spun. I wanted her to know that there was no escaping the truth anymore. So, I pulled out my phone, took a few photos of the inn, the unmistakable sight of her car parked alongside his. I captured every detail, knowing that this was the proof I needed. When she'd see these, there would be no denying it. That evening, I went home and waited. Claire returned late, slipping in as quietly as she could, probably thinking I was asleep. But I was wide awake, sitting at the kitchen table, the photos printed and lying in front of me like a silent accusation. She froze when she saw me. The look in her eyes, a mixture of guilt, shock, and something else I couldn't quite place, was all the confirmation I needed. "Oh, you're up," she stammered, trying to sound casual, but her voice betrayed her. I didn't say anything. I just stared at her, letting the silence stretch between us until she looked away, unable to meet my gaze. "Did you have a good night?" I asked finally, my voice cold, detached. She hesitated, her eyes flickering to the photos on the table, her face paling as she realized what I'd done. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The silence that followed my question hung in the air, thick and heavy. Claire's eyes widened as she took in the photos sprawled across the table. She swallowed, visibly struggling to find her voice, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind, scrambling for some way out. I'd been expecting anger or even shame, but what I saw in her eyes was something closer to desperation. "Why would you, what's this, Mark?" she asked, her voice shaking but with an edge of defiance as if she could bluff her way out of this. "Don't," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "I watched you, Claire. I followed you. I saw everything. So don't insult me by lying." Her face fell, her eyes dropping to the photos again, and for a long moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. I could feel my anger building, a storm of betrayal and hurt that threatened to break through at any moment. She looked away, biting her lip, and let out a shaky breath. I didn't mean for you to find out this way." "Oh, so you were planning to tell me?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or were you hoping I'd just go on, oblivious, while you snuck around with Jeremy, right?" At the mention of his name, she flinched. "Mark, please." "Don't you dare," I cut in. "Don't ask me to please at anything. You made your choice. And now you can explain yourself." Right here, right now. She crossed her arms, staring down at the floor, her voice barely a whisper. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, I replied, keeping my tone steady. You've hurt me more than you could ever imagine. So go on, Claire. Tell me why. She took a deep breath, as though steeling herself, and finally looked up at me, her face a mixture of guilt and regret. I don't know what you want me to say, Mark. It just happened. That's it? It just happened? You think that explains sneaking off to some sleazy-in with your work friend? It's not like that, she insisted, her voice rising defensively. Jeremy and I don't know, we just connected. He understands me in a way that... In a way that what? I interrupted, unable to contain the bitterness in my voice. In a way that I don't? That's convenient, Claire. Real convenient. But guess what? I didn't marry you to understand you perfectly every second of every day. I married you because I loved you. And I thought you loved me, too. She pressed her lips together, fighting back tears. I do love you, Mark. It's just, things changed. I changed. And somewhere along the way, I felt like I was losing myself. Jeremy, he just made me feel alive again. I let out a harsh laugh, incredulous. Alive? So you're telling me you didn't feel alive when we bought this house, when we built a life together, when we had everything we ever wanted? That wasn't enough for you? It's not that simple, she whispered, her voice cracking. I needed something for myself, something that wasn't about us or our life together. I needed to feel like I was still me. And you didn't think you could talk to me about that? I shot back. You didn't think you could come to your husband, the man who's been here for you through everything, the man who thought he knew you, and say, I'm struggling, I need help? Instead, you found it in him. A stranger. Do you have any idea what that feels like? She was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face as she stood there, defenseless. Mark, I'm sorry. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. Hurt me? I shook my head, feeling a bitter laugh rise up. You didn't just hurt me, Claire. You ripped apart everything I thought I knew. And for what? A few stolen moments with someone who doesn't even know the real you. Or maybe he does, I added darkly, unable to stop myself. Maybe he knows you better than I ever did. For a moment, her face hardened, a flash of anger breaking through her guilt. Don't you think I feel terrible about this? Don't you think I wish I could take it back? But I can't, Mark. It happened, and I can't change that. Her words hit me like a blow, and I took a step back, unable to look at her. It was true, nothing could undo this. No apology, no amount of regret would ever erase what she'd done. And as much as I wanted to scream, to break something, to force her to feel the pain she'd caused me, I knew deep down that it wouldn't change a thing. After a long, painful silence, I finally found the strength to speak. So what now, Claire? What am I supposed to do with this? She opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, her face twisting with a mixture of hope and desperation. Maybe we could try to move past it. Go to counseling, talk to someone. I want to make this right, Mark. I want us to fix this. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, a part of me almost believed her. But then I thought of all the lies, all the secrets she'd kept, the way she'd hidden this part of her life from me while pretending everything was fine. I thought about the look in her eyes when she'd come home late, the way she'd kiss me as if nothing had changed. You want to fix this? I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't get it, Claire. This isn't something you fix. This is something you destroy. And you destroyed us the moment you let him into your life. She took a step closer, reaching out as if to touch me, but I backed away, holding up a hand to stop her. Don't pretend that this is just some problem we can work through. Because right now, I can barely stand to look at you. The pain in her eyes was evident, and I knew my words had hit their mark. But there was no satisfaction in it, no sense of triumph. Just an overwhelming sadness, a hollow ache that made it hard to breathe. Finally, she looked down, defeated. "What do you want me to do, Mark?" I didn't have an answer. I'd thought about this moment for days, imagined what I'd say, how I'd confront her. But now that it was happening, I felt lost, adrift in a sea of anger and betrayal. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living like this, pretending everything was okay when my entire world had been torn apart. "Leave," I said, my voice cold, unrecognizable even to myself. "Pack a bag and go. I don't care where you go. Just get out." Her mouth opened in shock, and for a moment, I thought she was going to argue, to beg me to reconsider. But she must have seen something in my face, some finality that told her I was done, because she nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Without another word, she turned and walked up the stairs, her footsteps heavy, each one echoing like a nail in the coffin of our marriage. I listened to her moving around, the sounds of drawers opening and closing as she gathered her things. Part of me wanted to rush after her, to scream, to make her understand the depth of the pain she'd caused. But I stayed rooted to the spot, numb and exhausted, barely holding myself together. When she finally came back downstairs, a small bag in hand, she looked at me one last time, her face etched with regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For everything." I didn't respond. I didn't have the energy to forgive her, even if I'd wanted to. She opened the door, pausing as if waiting for me to stop her. But I didn't. I watched her walk out, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving me alone in the silent wreckage of what was once our life. In the stillness that followed, I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the empty seat across from me. The weight of it all crashed over me, a tidal wave of grief and rage and betrayal. I didn't know how long I sat there, but by the time I finally moved, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a cold light over the broken pieces of my world. And for the first time, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. In the days following Claire's departure, the house fell silent in a way that felt both comforting and unsettling. Her things were gone, her presence erased as though she'd never lived here. I went through each room, methodically removing any trace of her, boxing up clothes, jewelry, and photos until there was nothing left of her here but memories. It was a strange ritual, like preparing for a funeral without the body. In some ways, it felt final, in others, I was still haunted by every corner, every quiet space that seemed to hold echoes of her laughter, of the life we'd once shared. Despite the calm that had settled over the house, a gnawing emptiness consumed me. I found myself revisiting the moments we'd had together, the nights we'd stayed up talking, the lazy Sundays when we'd do nothing at all. And for all her betrayal, I couldn't deny that a part of me still missed her. As much as I hated what she'd done, the memories were relentless. They invaded my days, slipping into every quiet moment, every pause. It was as if the house itself was mourning her absence, reminding me constantly of what I'd lost. One evening, after work, I opened a bottle of wine and sat alone in the living room, staring at the shadows dancing across the walls. The silence was too heavy, suffocating, so I reached for my phone and found myself scrolling through old photos, pictures of us smiling at family gatherings, of weekend getaways, of her laughing at some joke I'd made. It felt surreal, seeing her like that, knowing what she'd done and still feeling the pangs of a love I couldn't entirely shake. Then, without thinking, I found myself calling her. I didn't know what I expected, maybe closure, maybe an answer to the question that had been haunting me, why? I let the phone ring, almost hoping she wouldn't pick up. But after a few rings, she did. "Mark?" Her voice was hesitant, tired. I swallowed, suddenly regretting the call. "Yeah. It's me." There was a long silence, each second stretching between us like a gulf neither of us could cross. "Why are you calling?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted. I needed to talk." She sighed softly, and I could hear the weight of her guilt, her sadness. "Mark, I'm so sorry for everything. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Yeah, well, it did, I replied, my voice thick with the bitterness I hadn't fully let go. And now I'm left here with nothing. Another pause, and then, almost reluctantly, she spoke. I don't know how to make it right, Mark. I don't think I can. I wish I could go back and change everything, but it's too late. Too late, I repeated, feeling the words sink into me. I'd known that, of course, but hearing her say it made it feel final, irreversible. We talked a little longer, the conversation stilted and awkward, like strangers trying to make small talk. Eventually, I told her goodbye and hung up, feeling more hollow than before. The call had given me no peace, only reminded me of the life we'd thrown away, of the future we'd lost. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Claire, her handwriting scrawled on the envelope, tentative as though she'd debated whether to send it at all. I opened it slowly, my hands trembling as I unfolded the paper. Dear Mark, I know that nothing I can say will make up for what I've done. I know that I hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I wanted to try, somehow, to explain myself. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve that. But I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. I was lost, Mark. I was struggling in ways I didn't even understand myself. Being with Jeremy wasn't about love, it was a way for me to escape myself, my insecurities, my fears. And in the end, it was a mistake. A mistake that cost me everything I ever wanted. If you never want to see me again, I understand. But I wanted you to know the truth. I wanted you to know that even when I was lost, I still loved you. And that love never went away. I'm sorry, more than you can imagine. I hope you can find happiness again, even if it's not with me. Forever, Claire. I sat there, the letter trembling in my hands, the words blurring as tears welled up. It was a sad kind of closure, a confession that offered no real redemption. She was sorry, she'd made a mistake, but it didn't change what she'd done. I crumpled the letter, the pain too fresh, too raw, and left the house, needing air, space, something to dull the ache inside me. It was late, nearly dusk, as I drove aimlessly, the streets quiet. I found myself driving toward the edge of town, where we'd often gone to watch the stars on summer nights, where we'd talked about our future, where we'd dreamed together. I pulled over, the memories too heavy to ignore, and sat in silence, letting the weight of it all press down on me. Then my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, my heart skipping a beat when I saw it was Claire. Against my better judgment, I answered. Claire? I said, the grief in my voice raw, unmasked. But it wasn't Claire's voice on the other end. It was unfamiliar, somber. Mr. Anderson? The voice was quiet, almost hesitant. This is Officer Mason with the City Police. I'm sorry to inform you that there's been an accident. The world tilted, my heart pounding as I tried to process the words. An accident? What are you talking about? It's Claire. She was in a car crash a short while ago. I'm so sorry, Mr. Anderson. She didn't make it. The words hit me like a punch, knocking the breath from my lungs. I sat there, the phone slipping from my hand, the officer's voice fading as I stared into the darkness. Claire was gone. The woman I'd loved, the woman who had betrayed me, was gone forever. And suddenly, the anger, the hurt, it all dissolved into something deeper, something I couldn't name. I drove to the hospital in a daze, barely registering the streets, the lights, the world around me. When I arrived, they took me to a quiet room, away from the noise and bustle of the emergency room. A nurse handed me her belongings in a plastic bag, a small, tragic bundle of the life she'd left behind. Her phone, her keys, her wallet. And inside the bag, tucked away, was the letter I'd written to her once, years ago, promising her forever. I sat alone, clutching her things, feeling the weight of everything I'd never get to say, of all the words left unsaid. The memories washed over me in waves, drowning me in a grief I hadn't thought possible. For all her mistakes, for all the pain she'd caused, I still loved her. And now, that love had nowhere to go. Days turned into weeks, each one bleeding into the next, hollow and grey. I went through the motions of the funeral, accepting condolences, seeing faces I barely recognized. People talked about forgiveness, about closure, but the words felt empty. How could I forgive someone who was no longer here? How could I find closure when every memory, every thought, was haunted by the things we'd never get to fix? One night, weeks later, I found myself back in that quiet spot on the edge of town, staring up at the stars alone. It felt like I was reaching out to something I couldn't see, searching for her, for a sign, for anything that could ease the ache that had settled in my chest. But there was only silence, only the endless, indifferent stars staring back. In the end, there was no grand moment of healing, no epiphany. Just a quiet, enduring sadness, a life now fractured and empty. I'd loved her, even in the end, even after everything. And now that love would be a wound I carried with me, a reminder of what could have been, of the life we'd left unfinished. And as I sat there, staring into the darkness, I realized that some things never truly heal. Some losses linger, like a shadow, following you in ways you can never quite escape.